So we've seen his answers to objections, that it will be highly impractical to create a system that will filter out the undeserving of the poor and also put the able-bodied to work. He says, look, we must eschew all programs that assume too optimistic a view of human nature. Let's face it, we must deal with humans as they are, not as what we would like them to be. And so, his final point is not only is it impossible to put such a program to work in such a way that it will eliminate the poverty rather than create a permanently impoverished class, but such a program will make us worse people to boot. It will make us morally more vicious, he says. And in this video and in the next, we're going to explain 3 ways in which it does that. So now let's think about what happens when you have a person who believes that they have a right to relief. And that's what we're talking about here with a government subsidized welfare program, is when the government runs it, it's because it is part of the view of the people and the government that everyone as a citizen, just by being a citizen of this nation, has a right to it. So therefore that I have a right to relief. Now think about what rights do for us. Tocqueville, like a good Enlightenment thinker, believes that rights dignify us, they ought to dignify us, that when I'm given a right among other citizens, then it equalizes me, it gives me more honor and dignity. And so every right that I am giving adds to my dignity and to my value, except for this supposed right, the right to relief. What is this right to relief but the right to remain inferior? It's the right to be a failure and to be honored for being a failure. It legalizes and grants inferiority a status in society, and therefore makes the person who appeals to this right and takes it to themselves have to admit their inferiority. It therefore doesn't give us more honor, it degrades rather than dignifies us. And he says this is really important because thus those who are in this permanent class, as he argued will happen, are going to be those who permanently think of themselves as less than everyone else. And a right is something that should equalize us. But this supposed right, it doesn't. And therefore it shouldn't be a right. But there's a second way it does this. Think of the 2 most important stabilizing factors in any society, in any community of social animals like humans. Benevolence and justice. Without these 2 important virtues, you can't have a society. You can't have social stability anyway. What is benevolence? Well, benevolence is, in the private context, as an individual virtue, as we've seen, is a good-heartedness that freely gives to those in need. And thus the person who is given to and the person who gives are tied together in free will obligation. Now you notice I say free will obligation. That sounds like a contradiction because an obligation is what you must do, whereas free will is what you don't have to do. You just do freely. But that's the interesting thing about things like gratitude and care, right? When I care for someone, I don't give because I have to, I give because I want to. And so I create the obligation on myself. So when a rich person or a person who has enough money gives, they do so because they feel good about doing so and they care about the people they're giving to. And so it establishes this tie of care and obligation, this desire to take responsibility for my neighbor, my brother. I am my brother's keeper when I'm benevolent. So in the individual context, that's what it does, right? And so thus it's not a right in that context. Now think about the person who receives, the poor person, the person who's suffering, who gets something that they know they don't have a right to. How do they feel? They feel grateful, don't they? They feel gratitude. And gratitude is that feeling of obligation, this desire to pay back, and this feeling of love for the one who gave to me. And so you see, benevolence ties the rich and the poor together closely when it's done as benevolence, i.e. as private charity. But now what happens when that benevolence is forced? In other words, when society just taxes the rich person, takes their money, and gives it to the poor person. Now it's a right to relief, isn't it? Now the poor person, when they receive that money, will never feel grateful. I don't feel grateful when you give me what is mine. I feel like, yeah, that's what you should have done anyway. I feel a sense of entitlement, don't I? And so therefore, it doesn't tie me to the giver, except as someone who's demanding that they give me what I ought to have. But then there's something more interesting. State charity can never be enough to make me have a really good life. I will always be in a lower position than the person who is forced to give. And so in a sense, it makes me bitter, because now I'm bitter that I don't really get what I think I deserve, and I'm on a lower level than the person who ought to give it to me. And so thus, instead of creating gratitude and care and a tie between the rich and the poor, it actually creates a scenario of conflict, of class struggle. Because now I'm entitled, but I don't get what I want. I feel bitter against the rich who have taken what I deserve. And not only that, but as a rich person, I feel offended in the sense that my money is taken without my permission. I am forced to be good, and therefore I am forced to act against my own self-interests. So as a rich person, I'm going to feel injustice, am I not? I'm going to feel as if my rightful property that I earned through my industry is now taken from me and given to those who have not worked for it and who feel like they deserve it. I'm going to have contempt for the poor and feel as if they are like criminals, the worst kind, in my opinion, as a person who's earned my money, and that is a freeloader. And so justice and benevolence are destroyed with public charity, because why give out of the goodness of my heart when I'm already forced to give through my taxes? And why also, therefore, am I going to support someone that I know is going to be supported anyway? So benevolence in such a society would be virtually destroyed. There would be no need for it. And all the goods that benevolence creates in stabilizing and tying us together as members of different classes in society now is no longer there. Instead, the fuel for the fire of class struggle comes in, and therefore the revolution of the proletariat is brought nearer by state charity rather than private charity. The third reason he says that we shouldn't give, that it makes us worse, is one that has to tie in with the level of idleness that this creates and how this idleness correlates with criminal activity. It actually corrupts us. It's like the old saying that idle time is the devil's workshop, and we'll deal with that separately in its own video.